Hello everyone, I am Rod and I am the game design instructor for the Academy of Entertainment Arts over at Dixie Hollands High School. If you are one of my students, it's Mr. Flowers to you, and welcome to this video tutorial. Hey guys, and we are back. In the last video we went ahead and set up the functionality for the sword so we can equip it and swing it. And in this tutorial we're going to look at setting up the functionality for our bow. And right now I'm inside of my weapon object. You can see it's selected down here. And here is the basic code. So we have, if we're in the game, we have our state, and then our case is if we have the sword drawn, this is what happens for the sword. And then down here we have the bow. Just we can equip it, but nothing really happens to it. Before we go into the nitty-gritty of the bow, we do need to modify the bow just a bit. So just like we did with our sword, go ahead and open up the bow object. And if you remember in the last few tutorials ago, we made the bow kind of like this. And I forget if we made this frame and then an open frame, but we will need to have an arrow drawn on there. So as you can take a look, I went ahead and I made these frames here. So here's a frame with the arrow, or with the bow not drawn, and of course there's no arrow here. Then I have a frame with the arrow being placed into the bow, and then a frame with the bow being drawn and the arrow being there. Now if you have not drawn the arrow for your bow yet, I would recommend going ahead and doing that, because we're going to use these frames to determine if the bow has any arrows, if it's loaded, and if it's being fired. You might want to know if why there's not a frame for the bow being drawn while it's empty. And if anybody's ever fired a bow, dry firing a bow actually breaks it. So you wouldn't want to have no arrows loaded if you were to pull back the string. You'd actually damage the bow doing that. So following real world logic to game logic. However, if you want that ability to dry fire your bow and break it and have like a durability setting, you're more than welcome to have like an empty, draw event or whatever. So I'm going to jump down into my weapon here. And inside my create event, we're going to have to add some variables. First variable is going to be is firing. That's going to be false. We're going to use that to determine if we're currently in a state of firing the bow. Next one's going to be fire delay. And that's going to be how long of a delay is it between every time we fire and every time we reload. I'm going to set that to 15, and then we're going to have our fire rate, which is going to be set to our fire delay. So what we're doing here is we're basically soft coding our fire rate. So our fire rate is really what's going to determine how fast we're firing. But this delay value is going to be the piece that we can change if we need to increase or decrease our fire rate. So if we wanted a faster fire rate, we would have a smaller number here. If we wanted a longer fire rate, we would have a larger number here, and so on. And then lastly, we want to know if our arrow is loaded. So we're going to have a variable called arrow loaded. We'll set that to false. Go into our step event here. And then inside of our state, I'm going to scroll down. So make sure we're inside of our state here. Scroll down to the case item list bow. Just like we did with our sword, we're going to set the left and right position of the bow. So in here, I'm going to do change direction. That's going to be if obj_player dot is facing to the left then we're going to do some stuff. So for my character, the position of my bow and my sword is about the same. So I'm actually going to copy some of the code above. So I'm going to go up here, so I don't have to rewrite everything. I'm going to grab this X and Y positioning for the weapon and grab that. come back down to my bow, and then inside my facing piece, I'll go ahead and paste that in. So this is going to be the same positioning. So my X is going to be object player dot X minus 32, and the Y position will be set to its Y. And then the additional piece here is going to be the part that flips my bow, and that's going to be image X scale. Since I'm going to the left, I'm going to draw the scale as a -1, and then I'm going to do an else, and I'm going to grab this, my position will now be a plus 32, and then my image X scale will be a +1. Now you can do this again for the sword. Generally a sword looks about the same left and right, so I didn't do that in the previous one, but in this case the bow does need to be facing along with the player, which is why this is being done here. So if I run this, we should be able to see the bow updating positional, should be updating its position to our player. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the sword and the bow. Of course, we know the sword's there, and as I flip it, that's fine. And you can see that my sword, the little cutout on the sword there, the cutout is there now. See, it doesn't really flip because I didn't tell it to. But on my bow, if I grab my bow and put that on, here's my bow position. And if I go this way or that way, you can see it does swap. Okay? But I am noticing there is a bit of a gap between my player and my bow. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move my bow, the origin point of the bow over some. I could do it in the code, but I'm just going to do it in the origin. It'll be simpler for me. Go ahead and grab my bow here, and then inside of my bow, I'm just going to move my cursor to about there. That way, the hand of the player is on the bow. I don't have a hand, but if he had one, it would be on the bow rather than the string. Before it was on the string. And if I run that, we should be able to see it good and ready. So there, it's right in front and right in front. So if you had like a little arm or something, you would see his arm holding the bow. Jump back into my weapon. And now we want to set up the conditions for firing the arrow. So underneath here, we're going to set up our fire delay. So we'll say run fire delay. So if fire delay, sorry, we're actually running our fire rate, not to confuse it, rate. So if our fire rate is greater than 0, it's going to count down. So you can say greater than 0, fire rate minus minus. What's interesting about this though, you could just say if fire rate, that way if there's any value in there, you can count down. So you could actually write this like this and it would still technically be valid and do what you want it to do. But I will keep it as greater than 0. Just so my brain recognizes what's going on. So if our fire rate has something to count, it'll count down. So next what we're going to do is check to see if it's okay to load the arrow. So we'll say load arrow if fire rate is less than or equal to 0. So if our fire rate is counted down, then it's okay to load the arrow. And we want to check to make sure we actually have arrows to load. So we haven't set the variable up yet, but we'll put one in just a minute. We're going to check the object player for the arrow count. So arrow count. So if we if the fire rate is ready, and of course we have arrows, then our arrow loaded will be true. Else arrow loaded will be false. Now we're going to draw the arrow in the loaded position. So draw arrow. If arrow is loaded, oops. So if our arrow is loaded and we are currently not firing, so not is firing. So if we're currently not firing and the arrow is loaded, then our image index for this case will be position 1. Whoops, I need an equal sign there. And if we look on my bow here, so position 0 is nothing in it. Position 1, it's ready, and then position 2 in this case would be it firing. And that's how exactly I'm going to set it up. So there's that one. I'm going to say else if arrow loaded and we are firing, so is firing, then image index will be 2. Otherwise, so else, image index will be 0. So if it's loaded, it'll draw the loaded picture. If it is loaded and we are clicking the button to fire, it'll draw the firing animation picture. And then when it's empty, it'll draw the empty picture. So now we're just going to set up the button so that we can actually fire it. So down here, I'll do fire arrow. So if we're going to use the mouse button again. So if mouse check button, I'm going to do pressed, mouse button left. If I hit the left mouse button, inside of here, we're going to have is firing true. And then I'm going to say else if mouse check button pressed. Sorry, this is going to be released. Mouse button check released. And that's going to be the left button. So this one is when we hold the button down. That way you can actually draw the arrow and hold it. And then inside of this if statement, as long as you are holding the arrow down, maybe there's like a time that you have it. So like full draw or partial draw, and you get more energy and more force. If you're going to use that kind of calculation, then you would do just a check the button, and then you do a release when it's done. But in this case, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to have it hold it, and it'll do this, and then so on. Close that parenthesis off, and then inside of here, we're going to set up the condition for when we release our trigger. So the first thing we're going to do is check to see if our player actually has arrows. Naturally, we can't shoot if we didn't have arrows, so whichever, but we're going to make sure that we can't by telling it not to. So if object player dot arrow count is greater than 0, so if our arrow count is greater than 0, then obj underscore player dot arrow count minus minus. So we're going to lose an arrow each time. So if player has arrows, fire an arrow. I'll say remove an arrow from quiver. And my player is spelled wrong. Make sure I spell that correctly. This next spot's going to be release arrow, and that's going to be if fire rate is less than or equal to 0, then we're going to be able to actually fire the arrow. So we're going to have our fire rate reset, so this is going to be our fire delay now. So fire delay. we are going to say that we are no longer firing the arrow because it's already out. So is firing will be false because we're no longer firing it, it's already gone. And then our arrow loaded will also be false because once we fire the arrow, it's no longer loaded and it's time to reset. So it'll go up and start counting again. Next, we're going to set up the control point for actually firing the arrow. So we'll say change direction. If object player dot is facing to the left, we're going to say create arrow, and we're going to do a with instance create depth x y -1. That'll be outside the bow, and obj underscore arrow. We have not yet created the object for the arrow, but we will in just a few minutes. Open brace, closing brace, and then inside of here we're going to do image x scale set to a -1, and then our velocity x for the arrow will be set to a minus move speed. I'm going to go ahead and copy this piece, and then for the else, go ahead and paste that in. That'll be a positive direction, so a +1 and a positive move speed. So now when we fire the arrow, if our player is facing to the left, it'll create the arrow and it'll draw it facing to the left, and it'll move to the left. Otherwise, if we're facing to the right, then it'll create the arrow facing to the right and it'll move to the right. And we're doing it this way so that the arrow doesn't change direction as our player changes direction. So if the arrow is already flying and we fire to the right and we look to the left, the arrow doesn't become a magic bullet and turn around and go to the left. We want this to check that it's only okay to do this at the moment it's created. We don't want it to update later. And with that, we should be able to fire the arrow once our arrow object is ready. So do a quick once over. Looks like everything's up to par. So now we're going to create the object for the arrow. So over in our objects here, I'm going to right click on my objects, create new object. This is going to be obj underscore arrow. Give it my arrow sprite. We made that in a previous tutorial. And I'll go ahead and add a create event. We're going to need some basic stuff, basic movement stuff. So initialize variables. Basic movement stuff, velocity x will be 0. If your arrow can move up, down, then you would want a velocity y. Mine can't, but for the sake of the tutorial, I'll put a vy in there. And then my move speed is going to be, I'll say 15. And then in here, you can do your damage variable in a few different places. So let's say you have a bow that is higher quality, then you could have your damage get some bonus from the bow. And then if you have like a flame arrow, then you get flame arrow damages or all that good stuff. So I'm going to put a damage value here. I'm just going to say a damage of like 3. If you have multiple arrows, you can create a state and then switch them or whatever. But this should be good enough to get us going. And then inside of our step event, so we'll add event, step, step. We will do update arrow, and that's going to be the x is plus equal to vx, and then y is plus equal to vy. And this should be good enough for testing, so let's go ahead and give it a whirl and see what happens. You know, it's probably going to crash because we did not give the arrow count to the player. So I'm going to close this because there's a good chance that when I try to fire the bow, it won't work. So I'm going to close that, and I'm going to open the player and make sure we give our player the arrow count. So arrow count. I'm going to give myself 5 arrows to start off with. And I'm going to draw this to the screen so that I can see the arrows. So I'm going to go to my object game here. Go into the Draw GUI event. That way this draws to the screen all the time and it gets updated. And I'm going to make a spot. I'll say draw player HUD variables. We'll say if instance exists obj_player. That way we don't have it trying to draw this stuff before the player is created. Otherwise you'd get an error. I'm going to throw this, I'm going to copy one of these here. These are being drawn every 12, so the next one would be 48. This is going to be, we'll say arrow count. And make sure I do the variable obj_player dot arrow count. So up at the top it is on the gray tile here, but you can see arrow, and my current count is 5. Go ahead and grab them, and you can see that since I have arrows, the arrow is loaded. Can I fire it? Okay, what's it say? Object.isFacing. Okay, there's a good chance that I did not tell it to check the correct object. So let's go take a look. This is on line 77 inside the weapon step event. So, weapon, step event. It said line 77. 77. Ah, I said is facing. This should be is firing. Let's try again. There we go. And can I fire? I can. You can see that the arrow leaves, and bam, and I can fire a couple. And I'm out, so I can't fire anymore. Okay. I'm gonna, if I go into the next room, of course my arrows don't update, so. Alright, I'm gonna exit and I'm gonna re-enter, make sure I can fire the other way. Grab it, and it loads in, and I can fire the other direction. Awesome. Okay, so that'll conclude this video. In the next few tutorials coming up, we'll look at how to damage the enemies, and we'll also look at how to collect more arrows. Because right now, if we grab an arrow, it does not update our current arrow count. So we're going to look at how to do that as well in the upcoming videos. So go ahead and save your work. Hopefully this has been educational for you. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, you're welcome to leave them below. And I'll see you guys next time.